My name is Brett Cohen. I'm the president of Quirk Books, and I've worked with tonight's guest for almost 16 years. Working in publishing, I'm surrounded by ridiculously talented and creative people. Tonight's guest, Jason Rekulak, is hands down the most creative person I know. But he also possesses that rare ability to blend creativity with commercial appeal by making the familiar feel new again. And that blend has been the hallmark of Jason's success as an editor, as a publisher, and now an author. As the publisher of Quirk Books, Jason created the literary mashup genre by conceiving Pride and Prejudice and Zombies and followed that with William Shakespeare's Star Wars. He has discovered several of today's best-selling authors, including Ransom Riggs, author of the Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children series. He's guided many authors to top awards and nominations, including Ben H. Winter's The Last Policeman series, which won an Edgar Award for Best Mystery. And he's personally acquired 12 New York Times bestsellers in the last 8 years. I can go on and on about Jason's publishing accomplishments, but tonight we are here for one very specific purpose: to celebrate the release of Jason's debut novel, The Impossible Fortress. I've read it, I enjoyed it immensely, and I can assure you that this book is Hallmark Jason. The Impossible Fortress is a unique blend. It's part coming-of-age tale, part love story, and part heist caper, wrapped in a love letter to the 1980s. Best-selling author Seth Grahame-Smith called it a sweet, funny, and moving tribute to nerd and misfits everywhere, before comparing it to an 80s Spielberg movie like E.T. or Goonies, where a group of kids on bikes can accomplish anything. Entertainment Weekly and Bustle listed it among their most anticipated novels of 2017, and everyone from the New York Times to Geekadelphia is talking about it. We are in for a real treat tonight, so please join me in welcoming Jason Rekulak to the Free Library.
So I thought I'd start when I get to these places. I'm going to tell people that, as Brett said, I am the publisher of Quirk Books, and you all live in Philadelphia, so you know what Quirk is. It's this amazing independent book publisher founded by David Borgenicht, who I think is here tonight. Is that you, Dave? So Dave founded it, hired me 17 years ago, and it's hands down the best job I've ever had. I love it. I work on some really spectacular books with really terrific people. Brett named some of them in the intro. These are books that everybody knows because they've made the movie, so they're popular now. Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children, Pride and Prejudice and Zombies. And this computer's making sound now right now. Kind of disconcerting. I'm going to turn this there. People ask sometimes if I have a favorite book, and that's a tricky question to answer. You're not supposed to have a favorite when you're the publisher, because it doesn't make authors feel good. It makes most of your authors feel bad. But I do have a favorite, and I'll tell you guys tonight since you're here. It's this book, Crafting with Cat Hair. This is a real book. This is the first time we ever translated a book from another language. This was a bestseller in Japan. And the idea with this book is that you take the hair of your cat and you iron it into a kind of felt, and then you use that felt to make more cats. So the cat on the right is made out of the cat on the left. And according to the book, cats love it. So that's a little bit about Quirk. Tonight I'm going to talk about my debut novel, The Impossible Fortress. And before I start, I want to tell you a little bit about where I'm from and my background, because I think I have a sort of unusual journey to writing this book and to book publishing in general. So I'll tell you a little bit about where I'm from. I was born in Perth Amboy, New Jersey. Anybody know Perth Amboy? Any Jersey people? Yes. If you don't know, Perth Amboy is just across the water from Staten Island. It's like New Jersey tried to do their own version of Staten Island, but they didn't have like a Manhattan budget. So this is the bridge that my grandmother's house is under. And I was a really happy kid. I liked my childhood. My dad was a construction worker. He was a drywall taper. And if you don't know what a drywall taper is, all you have to do is think back to the TV show Roseanne. John Goodman on Roseanne, he was a drywall taper. And my mom's name is actually Roseanne. So when I was younger, we took great delight in watching that show. But, and you know, as a kid, I loved books, I loved reading, I loved writing, but I never thought I would work in publishing. I never thought I would write a book because everybody told me you had to have connections. You know, I remember when I was really young, I said, yeah, I'm gonna write a book someday. And this relative of mine, he said, oh, you know, your cousin Sheila tried to write a book, nobody would publish it. You gotta be connected, you know? And so I kind of just sort of like, well, all right, this is gonna be impossible. You know, it's like wanting to work in the White House or, you know, wanting to be an astronaut. So what I ended up doing was I had like all these stories I wanted to tell, and I sort of channeled all that energy into video games. When I was a kid, I was born in '71, so you know, arcade games were just taking off when I was a kid. This isn't me in an arcade, but I think I probably looked like this guy. You know, he looks so he looks so happy to be there. And when I was a kid, you know, people didn't have computers in their homes. You know, look at this ad. This is an IBM ad. I love it because it's like under $18,000. But in the early 80s, you know, a lot of you recall, like, these machines started getting popular. You know, you had things like the Apple II. I love this ad with, like, mom at the sink washing vegetables or something, and the guys at the table. Here's dad with his TRS-80 and his tuna fish sandwich. See the computers connected to the TV, which is what a lot of us did back then. Here's mom, relaxing with a glass of Merlot and her Equinox 100. I don't know what that is. I love this one. This guy has a yeah. I know she's impressed by his laptop. This one is really funny. This computer came with 8 colors. That was the big hook. And to sort of amplify that message, they even colored the keys. So the keys are all different colors. And then maybe my favorite, I've never actually seen this one in real life, but it's called the Imagination Machine. Your life will never be the same, is what the ad says. And like, look at this thing. It's got a computer keyboard, a tape deck, that's a cassette deck on the right, 2 joysticks. You know, so you know, they were trying to figure out what home computers were. Nobody really knew. And the most popular home computer of the 1980s was this machine called the Commodore 64. And in my neighborhood, there was this typewriter store that decided to start selling them, and they had them set up in the back of the store. And you could go in and you could try them. They also had them at like Sears and all kinds of other places. And I remember walking into the store and just starting around and play with things. And you know, the first thing you learn when you're messing around with these things and programming in BASIC is you learn how to put text on a screen. So my first program, it looked something like this. You know, line 10 prints Lionel Richie is awesome because, again, this is like 1985, and we all thought he was awesome. And then line 20 sends the computer back to line 10, so it just loops over and over and over and over and over. And you know, something about this just lit up my brain. I loved it. I loved that you could put words on a screen and you could move them around and you could change the colors. And so I would start going to the store every day just to put words on the screen, and I would stay as long as I could until they kicked me out. And so, you know, I would make screens like this, you know what I mean? like it just sort of didn't really make any sense. But I just knew right away that what I wanted to do was make video games and have my own software company. And so I managed to convince my parents to get me one of these machines, and I went to work teaching myself how to program them. And the way you did it back then, because I didn't know any other computer programmers, I knew nobody, you'd get these books, and they look like this, and they would just, or you'd get magazines in the mail, and they'd be full of code. And I would just spend hours and hours typing this stuff in. It was really, really tedious. And if you made one mistake, it didn't work. So, but that's sort of how I learned how to program computers. And I started making my own games and, you know, programming my own graphics. And this is about as sophisticated as they were. It was pretty simple stuff. So you had these stick figures. And then I learned how to animate them. And they'd move like this. And because it was so simple, I would write these long stories that would sort of preface the game. So like before you could play, you'd have to read like screens and screens and screens of history explaining that this guy on the left, his parents were murdered and his sister's on the right and she was kidnapped. And I would do it to sort of detail the graphics. I would do it all with words, and the screens looked like this. Don't read this because like, this is like this is. So go back to these guys. And so that's where I was. And so I really thought, I was like, wow, and I loved video games because you had control over everything. You did all the music, you did all the graphics, you did all the sound, you did all the gameplay, and then you'd even do like the box, and then ended up at the mall, and people bought it, and that was really exciting to me. It's a lot like working at an independent book publisher now, I mean, the number of parallels, what appealed to me about video games back then, when one person made the whole game, it's very similar to my job at Quirk. So I went to Penn State. I majored in computer science. After a couple semesters, I took a writing elective, and I realized that writing was everything I loved about video game design without any of like the annoying computer stuff. So I switched to English, and I never wrote another line of code. I was done. Like that was it. I started reading books and writing like crazy, and I never even played another video game. Like I sort of lost interest in all of it. And then I got a job in publishing, and now 20 years later, I work at Quirk, and so that's my weird sort of route into the industry. As for this book, I'm going to read a short passage. It's like 5 minutes, but I'm going to tell you a story before I read it just to sort of set it up. What happened with this was like 5 years ago. So I've been living in Philly since '99. My dad got really sick. He had a stroke, and then he had another stroke, and he had another stroke, and this is like one after another for a couple months. So I started going home every weekend, and I hadn't been home in a long. Well, I didn't spend a lot of time at home, but I was suddenly spending a lot of time at home, and I'm going through this train station in this town where I grew up, in this shop where I would play all these computer games and learn computer programming. And I'm feeling I'm feeling nostalgic or something, and I'm spending a lot of time sitting in waiting rooms. Like I'm just constantly sitting in hospital waiting rooms. I'm waiting for trains. And so one day, after like a couple weeks of this, I went into the hospital gift shop and I bought this notebook, and I started writing down stories that like I remembered, and they made me laugh. And believe it or not, like the thing I'm going to read you is the beginning of my book, and I actually wrote it in like the lobby of an ICU, which I think is proof if anybody's a writer, you can write anywhere. So this is the beginning of my book. It's about 5 minutes, and I'll just start. Okay. My mother was convinced I'd die young. In the spring of 1987, just a few weeks after my 14th birthday, she started working nights at the Food World because the late shift paid an extra $1 an hour. I slept alone in an empty house while my mother rang up groceries and fretted over all the terrible things that might happen. What if I choked on a chicken nugget? What if I slipped in the shower? What if I forgot to turn off the stove and the house exploded in a fiery inferno? At 10 o'clock every evening, she'd call to make sure I'd finished my homework and lock the front door. And sometimes she'd make me test the smoke alarms, just in case. Naturally, I was thrilled with this arrangement. I felt like the luckiest kid in the 9th grade. My friends Alf and Clark came over every night, eager to celebrate our newfound freedom. We watched hours of TV, we blended milkshakes by the gallon, we gorged on Pop-Tarts and pizza bagels until we made ourselves sick. We played marathon games of Risk and Monopoly that dragged on for days and always ended with one angry loser flipping the board off the table. We argued about music and movies. We had passionate debates over who would win in a brawl, Rocky Balboa or Freddy Krueger, Bruce Springsteen or Billy Joel, Magnum P.I. or T.J. Hooker or MacGyver. Every night felt like a slumber party, and I remember thinking the good times would never end. But then Playboy magazine published photographs of Wheel of Fortune hostess Vanna White in her underwear. I fell head over heels in love, and everything started to change. Alf found the magazine first, and he sprinted all the way from Zelensky's newsstand to tell us about it. Clark and I were sitting on the sofa in my living room, watching the MTV Top 20 video countdown, when Alf came crashing through the front door. Her butt's on the cover, he gasped. Whose butt? Clark asked. What cover? Alf collapsed on the floor, clutching his sides and out of breath. Vanna White, the Playboy. I just saw a copy, and her butt's on the cover. This was extraordinary news. Wheel of Fortune was one of the most popular shows on television, and hostess Vanna White was the pride of our nation, a small-town girl from Myrtle Beach who skyrocketed to fame and fortune by flipping letters and word puzzles. News of the Playboy photos had already made supermarket tabloid headlines. You have to picture all caps here. The shocked and humiliated Vanna claimed the explicit images were taken by a jealous ex-boyfriend bent on destroying her reputation. She filed a $5.4 million lawsuit to stop their publication, but a judge dismissed the case, and now, after months of rumors and speculation, the magazine was finally on newsstands. It's the most incredible thing I've ever seen, Alf continued. He climbed onto a chair and pantomimed Vanna's cover pose. She's sitting on a windowsill like this, and she's leaning outside like she's checking the weather, only she's not wearing pants. Her butt is like right there. That's impossible, Clark said. The three of us lived on the same block, and over the years we'd learned that Alf was prone to exaggeration, like the time he claimed John Lennon had been assassinated by a machine gun on top of the Empire State Building. I swear on my mother's life, Alf said, and he raised his hand to God. If I'm lying, she can get run over by a tractor trailer. Clark yanked down his arm. You shouldn't say stuff like that, he said. Your mother's lucky she's still alive. Well, your mother's like McDonald's, Alf snapped. She satisfies billions and billions of customers. My mother, Clark asked. Why are you dragging my mother into this? Alf just talked over him. Your mother's like a hockey goalie. She changes her pads after 3 periods. He had an encyclopedic knowledge of your mother jokes, and he unleashed them at the slightest provocation. Your mother's like a Japanese steakhouse. Clark flung a pillow across the living room, hitting Alf square in the face. Enraged, Alf threw it back twice as hard, missing Clark and toppling my glass of Pepsi. Fizzy foam and soda went sloshing all over the carpet. Shit, Alf exclaimed. I'm sorry, Billy. It's all right, I said. Just grab some paper towels. There was no point in making a big deal. It's not like I was going to ditch Alf and Clark for a bunch of new and more considerate friends. 9 months ago, the three of us arrived in high school, and we watched our classmates dive into sports or clubs or academics. Yet somehow we just orbited around them, not really fitting in anywhere. I was the tallest boy in 9th grade, but it was not the good kind of tall. I wobbled around school like a baby giraffe, all skinny legs and gangly arms, waiting for the rest of my body to fill in. Alf was shorter, stouter, and cursed with the same name of the most popular alien on television. A 3-foot-tall puppet with his own NBC sitcom. The shared resemblance was uncanny. Both Alfs were built like trolls with big noses, beady eyes, and messy brown hair. Still, for all of our flaws, Alf and I knew we were better off than Clark. Every morning he rolled out of bed looking like a heartthrob in Tiger Beat magazine. He was tall and muscular with wavy blonde hair, deep blue eyes, and flawless skin. Girls at the mall would see Clark coming, and they'd gape open-mouthed like he was River Phoenix or Kiefer Sutherland, until they got close enough to see the claw, and then they quickly looked away. A freakish birth defect had fused the fingers of Clark's left hand into a pink, crab-like pincher. It was basically useless. He could make it open and close, but it wasn't strong enough to lift anything heavier than a magazine. Clark swore that as soon as he turned 18, he was going to find a doctor to saw it off, even if it cost $1 million. Until then, he went through life with his head down and the claw tucked into a pocket, avoiding attention. We knew Clark was doomed to a life of celibacy, that he'd never have a real flesh-and-blood girlfriend, so he needed the Vanna White Playboy more than anyone. Is she on the centerfold, he asked. I don't know, Alf said. Zelinsky has it on the rack behind the cash register next to the cigarettes. I couldn't get anywhere near it. You didn't buy it, I asked. Alf snorted. Sure, I just walked up and asked for a Playboy and a 6-pack too. Because why not? Are you crazy? We all knew that buying Playboy was out of the question. It was hard enough buying rock music, what with Jerry Falwell warning of satanic influences and Tipper Gore alerting parents to explicit lyrics. No shopkeeper in America was going to sell us that magazine. Howard Stern says the pictures are incredible, Clark explained. He said you see both boobs super close up. Nipples, milk ducts, the works. Milk ducts, I asked? Duct, with a T, Clark corrected. They're the red rings around the nipples, Alf explained. Clark shook his head. Those are areolas, dummy. The milk duct is the hollow part of the nipple where the milk squirts out. Nipples aren't hollow, Alf said. Sure they are, Clark said. That's why they're sensitive. Alf yanked up his t-shirt, exposing his flabby chest and belly. What about mine? Are my nipples hollow? Clark shielded his eyes. Put those away, please. I don't have hollow nipples, Alf insisted. They were always vying to prove which one knew more about girls. Alf claimed authority because he had 3 older sisters. Clark got all of his information from The Joy of Sex, a book he'd found buried at the bottom of his father's underwear drawer. I didn't try to compete with either one of them. All I knew was that I didn't know anything. So that's a passage from the book. Now, in Alf's defense, her butt is on the cover. It's like right there. This was a big deal. It's hard to believe. This is the most risque part of the whole photo shoot. The rest of the shoot, she really is in her underwear. But yet this was a big deal in 1987. Here's the cover of the National Enquirer. This is in the headlines at the supermarket. Johnny Carson talked about these photos every night for months. So if you were a 14-year-old boy, they had to be witnessed. You had to sort of see what all these adults were talking about. And so in the book, these boys, as the story starts, they sort of create this plan to break into a newsstand and steal the magazine. I sort of pitched this thing as like Freaks and Geeks meets Ocean's 11. But I'll tell you, here's what I think is really cool about this magazine, what's interesting about it. If you look at these photos now, something about the passage of time has drained them of their powers. And I think this happens a lot. Just to give you some other examples for the ladies. This guy was like a huge sex symbol back then. Look at these guys. And these were some of the hottest guys of the 80s. But when you look at them now, your first instinct is to laugh. When you think about Vanna White, your first instinct now is to laugh. And, as I was writing the book, I thought about, why does that happen? And my only conclusion is that, some of this stuff is just like topical or temporal. And, someday teenagers now are going to look back at this guy. I forget who this is. It's like Justin Bieber. And I think this is Miley Cyrus. And they're going to wonder what the heck they were thinking, too. My narrator, Billy, he gets an inkling of this idea when, encasing the store that they're going to rob, he meets this girl who works in the store, and he thinks she's really cool. And he finds himself in a dilemma because he has these feelings that feels like they're sort of like really private, and he doesn't really know what to do with them. And then you've got like this sort of media onslaught of like, this is what's hot and this is what's sexy. And if you want to know the secret of my book, in editorial we talk about structure a lot. You sort of have like the surface structure of the story, and then you have like the secret structure of the story. And the secret structure of my book is that I try to write every scene so that it's pushing Billy this way or that way, this way or that way. And the whole book he's going back and forth, back and forth. And I won't spoil where he ends up. But that's what I wrote about. That's sort of the pitch that I have for people when I take it on the road. Because I'm here in Philadelphia and I don't want to take any chances, I do have a friend who's going to come up and join me. My friend Doogie Horner, I think he's one of the funniest people I know. I've worked with him for a long time. All those cool books I showed you at the beginning, he did the covers of. So he's a longtime friend of mine. He's also a comedian. You may have seen him at Helium. And on America's Got Talent. For like one glorious summer, he was a contestant on America's Got Talent. And I would call in every Wednesday night to vote for him. So do you want to come on up?
That was a great talk, Jason. How about a big hand for Jason for that talk? It's fantastic. I didn't realize it was going to be so racy. There was going to be so much talk about milk ducks.
Yeah, I felt a little weird.
Racy.
Felt weird doing that. But
You might want to turn my mic up a little bit, actually.
this one's not on. Hello?
Is this one on at all? Oh, okay.
Mine's
Jason?
not on. It's okay. You can just do the next 20 minutes.
Can you guys hear Jason?
Okay.
Is it on now?
I think so.
There you go. All right. Fantastic. Well, we're just going to have a quick conversation about the book. I'm going to ask Jason some questions, and it's going to be very casual, very improvisational. If you like jazz, you're going to love this. So I'd like to start with like the background of the book. And you said that this book is based partially on growing up.
Yeah.
And a lot of your experiences growing up. How similar is the main character, Billy, to how you were when you were a kid, as far as not just his interests, but his personality and his relationships with his friends and trying to figure girls out and stuff like that. And
Yeah, I mean, it's a, I don't know, it's like autobiographical, but not. Like, none of the stuff that happens in the book is stuff I actually did, but it's sort of the sensibility that I had, you know? And, you know, I mean, obviously, I grew up in a town very much like the town in the book. I was obsessed with computers. There's a great scene where I like the scene. It's one of my favorite scenes. It was my favorite scene because I wrote it. It's just pure fact. There's a scene where the boy he has to work in a cosmetics factory for 3 months, putting caps into mascara tubes. And I did that for 3 months. It was the most horrible,
oh my God.
horrible job. I sat on a stool, and my view was a cinder block wall. And the tubes would just come down, and I had a box of just brush caps on my lap. And I did that for 12 weeks, 40 hours a week.
Jeez. That's like the worst job I could possibly think of.
It was the worst job.
The other characters in the book, were they based on people you knew in real life too?
Everybody's like an amalgam of, you know, a couple different people.
Yeah.
You know, the friends are like, you know, parts of different people.
Was it difficult to think like a teenager again, to kind of put yourself back into that mindset and remember how did I really feel when I was that age?
No, I don't think so. I mean, you know, I think the work I do at Quirk is like, you know, I mean, this kid's like a really creative, ambitious kid, and he has a sort of big vision to like make video games and run his own company. And so I just sort of like channeled all the stuff that like I do at my day job, you know, like he's really excited about making this game, and he wants it to be, well, I guess I didn't get into this. Over the course of the book, these two teenagers, the girl that he meets in the store, they start working on a video game together, and it's called The Impossible Fortress, and they start making this game to win a contest. So, you know, there's a lot of stuff in there about like creativity and ambition and design, and so, you know, all that stuff is just like lifted from book publishing, I think, you know.
Yeah. You said as a kid you were really inspired by video games, but were there any books that you liked? Did you read books too?
Oh yeah, I read books like crazy. I didn't read the books that I was assigned in school. I shouldn't say, oh God, my kids are here. I read, we'll talk about it later.
Your dad's a rebel, kids. Get used to it.
Yeah, I know. You know, I was reading like Stephen King. I was reading like science fiction novels. You know, I was constantly going to the library and getting books out. But, you know, it's funny. I had to read Jane Austen, Pride and Prejudice in high school, and I hated it. I thought it was just I thought it was a little slow, you know. I was like,
Thought I could use a little something else?
This book could use a little something, but I filed that idea away for like 20 years, you know. So, you know.
That's funny. Aside from, so a lot of this book is based on stuff that really happened to you in your life. Were there other inspirations, like movies from the 80s or other things that inspired the general feeling? You mentioned like, or I've heard other people say that this feels like a John Hughes film.
Yeah, I mean, I love those movies. When I was a kid, I loved like 80s teen movies, and I did want this to feel like a movie. I wanted it to feel really fast. You know, the book is like 75,000 words, which is not short, but people will tell me they read it in like 6 hours.
It's
you know, and I think it's because like it's just like I wanted it to feel like a movie and just be really fast-paced.
So I saw you mention in another interview that this isn't the first book that you've written. I know you've written a lot of books for Quirk. So if you guys don't know, he's written a lot of books for Quirk under various pseudonyms. Charles Gilman was your pseudonym for the Lovecraft middle school series, and the Home Alone book, and a bunch of other stuff. But you also, on your own time, wrote a couple novels, right?
Yeah, you know, I mean, I've been writing like a long time, and, you know, I don't really like to talk about it, so I'm glad you brought it up.
We're asking the hard-hitting questions here, Jason.
Yeah.
We are.
My wife, Julie, knows. I mean, she's really the only one who knows because she sees me at the kitchen table all the time. But, you know, what would happen is I would write these books, and I would work on them for like 2 years, and then I would be like, oh, this doesn't really work. You know, you'd sort of like find that like you'd get like, I would just finish them, and I would think they didn't work. So I would just put them in a box under my bed, and I'd be like, well, I'm going to do something else. And I'll tell you something, Julie has a lot of patience for putting up with that because there's no fun being married to a writer for 20 years who just sticks the books under the bed. You know what I mean? Like, there's a lot of fun stuff we could have been doing while I was working on those books, and we weren't doing it. So, Julie, I appreciate your patience.
I know you don't want to talk about it, but can you talk about Tough Cookies Don't Crumble? At least.
That's not what it was called.
Well, what's it called? This one
It's
book,
not-
it's the greatest premise. It's not called Tough Cookies Don't Crumble.
Well, you know, all right, I'll tell you.
But-
I'll tell you this one. Even though this book did not work, it was not good. It's under my bed in a box.
Such a great
And
idea.
so, and this was a couple years ago, and my wife and I, or maybe this is just me, I don't know. I love movies where spouses try to kill each other. You know what I mean? And I think you do too, right? Like anytime Michael Douglas is in the movie and he's got like a starched shirt on and like he has a mistress and I'm like, oh, this is gonna be good. I love those kinds of movies.
He's always in trouble.
And he's always in trouble. And so I wanted to write and the premise was gonna be like sort of like a faux self-help book, and it was called The 7 Secrets of Killing Your Spouse. And it was gonna walk you through how to plan the perfect murder. And there'd be like nonfiction tips, like there'd be call-outs and like boxes and sidebars, you know, as you're like constructing your alibi and all this stuff. And this woman was going to use her real murder as like a case study. And so it was not called Tough Cookies Don't Crumble. But I did read a lot of books like Tough Cookies Don't Crumble. Like I looked at like self-help books and I was trying to like channel like that crazy voice of self-help people. But the book didn't work, so it's under my bed.
So when you started this story, how much of the plot did you have figured out at the beginning? Did you just have like the characters and the scenery, or did the whole plot before you started writing? Did you outline the whole thing?
Yeah, I did. I outlined everything, which is something that was new for me. I wrote that part that I read in the hospital, and then I sort of sat down and I tried to figure out everything that was going to happen. And so by the time I actually got around to writing it, I think I spent like 3 months trying to figure out what should happen in the book. And then writing it was the most fun I've ever had writing anything. I have like struggled with projects all my life, and where you're like beating your head against the wall and you're like, why can't I get this to work? But this book was pure pleasure from start to finish. Like I never had a bad day. I did it basically from like 9 to 11 at night. My kids, they would go to bed early back then. It was so nice. Like they'd go to bed at like 7:30. And so, I have time to like unwind, then I would sit down and I'd write for 2 hours. And I look forward to it every day. Like I loved it. So.
Were there any parts of the story where you got stuck?
Nope.
Wow.
Never got stuck. I know. It was a miracle. Like it'll never happen again. Like I'm convinced, like somehow, I don't know, what's that expression? Like sometimes a blind squirrel finds a nut or something like that. Like I think
it's, yeah. I think we're all familiar with that. We've all seen it. You're in the park and you're like, oh, look at that, you just bumped into it. This book is it's a lot of different things. It's a romance. It's about like guy-dude friendship. It's a heist. For you, what was the emotional core of the story? Was it tough to keep track of that?
No. To me, I don't know. It's hard to like explain without people who haven't read the book. But like, I love characters. I love books where like somebody has like a sort of moral quandary and they have a choice to make, but both options are not good. Like I think those kinds of stories are like irresistible because like once you set something like that up, it's just, I feel like it's like bulletproof. If you can like sort of create that kind of situation, and I felt like I sort of created this impossible situation for him to resolve.
Kind of an impossible fortress.
So, anyway.
Do you know, this may be a tough question to answer, but at the end of the book, we find Billy at a crossroads. And do you know, in your head when you were writing it, like the book, I don't want to ruin it, but it stops at a point where you're like, I wonder what happens next, or like what Billy's future is going to be like. Do you know what happens to him after this book, like in your minds?
Yeah, I do. I do. But I don't want, it'd be weird to talk about it.
No, we can't
People
talk
haven't read
about it.
the
I was
book
just
yet,
kind of wondering. So when you finish the book, you said it was a piece of cake. You felt really good the whole time you were writing it. But then when you finished it, were you nervous at all when you sent it out? Like, you're writing it alone and now you're opening the door. Were you concerned about how people would receive it?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I wasn't concerned because like I enjoyed it so much. Like I was like, well, you know what? I don't care if anybody likes it or not. I like it, you know. And I would have been happy to just put it under the bed and start another one. But you know, the thing is, I mean, I have to say, like, this is one way, like, my day job has just been like a tremendous gift for me because it's made me much more. I just feel more comfortable about like knowing or feeling like when something is like commercial, you know what I mean? And like, and I sort of wrote this book and I was like, wow, if this book landed on my desk, I wish this book would land on my desk because I felt like it had like a lot of good marketing hooks. And so when I sent it out, I was like, wow, I'd be surprised if nobody thinks this book is, you know, commercial, you know, like saleable.
So it was really helpful having a lot of experience on the other side of publishing.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. You know, for example, like, as I was writing the book, these kids are making this video game on a Commodore 64 computer, and like that was maybe in my third draft, and I had this idea, and I was like, oh, it would be cool if I made the game in real life, and then readers, when they finished the book, they could actually go online and play the game. So, and it's also, you know, when you're writing, you love an excuse to stop writing and do something else. So I'm like, oh, you know, I've got to stop writing. I've got to download an emulator for my Mac and start playing some video games, which is what I did. So, so I started downloading all these old Commodore 64 games, and you know, they're all from like 1985. And what I realized really quickly is that these old games are terrible. You know, like if you in your memory, you're like, oh, that was so much fun, but like, I'll tell you what, go back and play Space Invaders now, and it's horrible. It's really tedious. And so I started writing the game in Commodore 64 BASIC, this ancient computer language. And if you look at the book, the chapters are prefaced with like passages of code that are from this attempt that was sort of short-lived. But I realized really soon that what I needed was a game that sort of looked and felt and sounded like a game from the 80s, but actually used modern computer technology and speed to be fun. So I reached out to a guy named Dan Vaquito, who's sort of like an indie game designer, and I said, hey, I want you to create the game that's in my book. You know, so I sent him the manuscript, and he read it, and he was really into the assignment. He did a great job, and so now the game is up on my website. If you go to jasonrekulak.com, you can play the game that the kids make in the book, which I mention all this because that's like one marketing hook. You know what I mean? You just use that to like sell a book.
Yeah.
And it's fun, and it's just like this nice sort of bonus thing, you know?
It's an awesome game. It's really cool.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So we're gonna have it in the lobby afterward. I have a
you can play
laptop,
it.
and if people want to give it a shot, it's we'll have it up there.
I really like the cover of the novel. Was it tricky to land on a cover for the book? Because, like we said, the book has so many different elements. It's got romance. It's got like adventure. It's got the 8-bit stuff.
Yeah, and we have covers for all of those things. I don't know if people saw the slideshow at the start.
The covers that were up on the screen when you walked in were all the different ones.
And so there were like 82 different covers to this book. And early on, my editor came to me and she said, so what do you think for the cover? What do you want to do? Should we show Wheel of Fortune? Should we show computers? And I said, you know what? You just need to get Will Staley. Will Staley's here tonight. He's all the way from Seattle. Is he here? Oh, there he is. Will Staley is like he's just an amazing cover designer. And do you want to say anything about what the covers process was like? You had to do all 82 of them. I don't know. No. It was
brutal.
So, I don't know. They couldn't decide. I think they're like, it should be for men. It should be for women. It should be for Gen Xers. It should be for millennials.
There's so many different things going on.
So,
it's a lot of layers in that book.
So I don't know. What do you think? Which one did you like best?
I think this one is the right cover for the book. I think it will appeal to the most people, and it makes it look fun and light. It's got the right vibe, and kind of has a little bit of the romance feel to it. There was one that was this giant maze that I personally liked more, but I think it wouldn't have had as broad an appeal. It made it look a little too dark.
So have you heard from Vanna White or her people? I assume she has people. Like, 'cause this
Okay.
is sort of dredging up something that she probably doesn't want.
Well, right. So here's the
Remember.
crazy thing. I mean, she really is. She's just in her underwear. Like these photos today, you see them on Instagram. You know, like people people put photos of themselves. Like you see it like on CBS at 9:00. But she is not happy about these pictures. So I'm always like very clear to say like these photos they're not bad. You know, like it's not like they're not really dirty. You know what I mean? But the lawyers at Simon & Schuster did a very close read of the manuscript before it went to press. And I actually had to send them the magazine. I had to go buy it on eBay and send them a copy just to, say, this really did happen. This is how, and she did file a $5.2 million lawsuit to stop them from being printed. So no, I've not heard from her, and I don't think she'll be joining me on my world tour.
And in the vest.
Jason, I hope maybe you'll recognize the voice in the face.
I sure do
All
recognize
right.
the voice.
Well, this is an old fogey question from one of your former teachers. I've heard you describe your mashup books as mashups as cool. And the question I came in with was, would you say that they're all homages to these great works of wonderful literature? But since you revealed the autobiographical fact that you found Pride and Prejudice slow in high school, and I think it's unfair to subject Pride and Prejudice to high school students. That's unfair. Number one question, have you read Pride and Prejudice as an adult? And number two, do you think there's an element of sort of adolescent revenge in the way that you concocted then this zombie book?
That's an excellent question, Dr. Smith, and I'm surprised to see you here all the way from Penn State. I know, I see you. I'll tell you what, I have read Pride and Prejudice. It's a terrific novel. I don't think I encountered it at the right age, and I'm sure you know that happens all the time. But when we worked on that book, I mean, it is an incredible novel. I mean, everybody knows this, right? It's obvious now. But like when I was 17, what did I know? I was in New Jersey, and I'm reading about farms and But when we did the Pride and Prejudice and Zombies book, we were trying to sort of keep as much of that novel as possible and sort of like add the zombies to the book in a way that sort of felt seamless. So like, and I'll give you a great example. Like there's a scene that's early in the novel, and Elizabeth Bennet has to, she's trying to get to this neighboring estate, and there's no carriage to take her or something like that. And she's like, you know what, I'm gonna walk. And they're like, walk? You can't walk. Are you crazy? It's too dangerous out there. And they're going on and on about a lady should never walk to a neighboring estate because it's so dangerous and the woods are so hostile. And all that is like in Jane Austen's original novel, but in our zombie novel, it takes on like this whole new meaning because, you're thinking, well, the roads are full of the undead. And so all we did then was add a scene where she does encounter a zombie on the road, and they do some martial arts, and she kills the zombie and gets blood all over her clothes. But then when she shows up at the estate, we actually revert back to Jane Austen's original language, and Elizabeth Bennet is sort of like in shambles, and everyone's sort of appalled and like, look at her, she's a mess. That's all like Jane Austen's book. So I feel like the people who like that book the most are actually people who know the novel the best, because they sort of appreciate like the way it takes all those really classic scenes from the novel and just sort of like puts a spin on them. So, props to Jane Austen. She's a great writer. I mean, no disrespect.
So, you may have answered this with your reading of the first few pages, but is this something I can read to my kids?
Yeah. I mean, like they're sort of like right on the cusp. You know what I mean? Like it's about 14-year-old boys. I don't know what the kids are doing at school. Like I know there's like stuff happening that I'm not privy to. So, I mean, maybe wait another year or two. But I think that you're right on the line. I know that they're thinking they're going to market this book. They sort of struggled. This happens all the time in publishing now because everyone's like, oh, it's about teenagers. It should be YA. But that's not really true. Like, not every book about teenagers should be sold as YA, and in a way, it's kind of an arbitrary distinction anyway. So I think this book is really for adults, but I think they are going to sell some copies to teenagers and things like that. I have no idea. I think some teenagers might read this and feel like it's historical fiction, you know, because they're going to be like, what do you mean? You didn't have cell phones? And so, I don't know.
I'm curious if you're still in contact with any of your childhood friends and if you've talked to any of them about your book.
I have, yeah, actually it's funny, I'm doing an event in Central Jersey on Wednesday, and I think a bunch of them are going to be there, so, you know, they'll recognize pieces and things like that. It's going to be a little weird.
What do you think your friend Alpha's going to think about the book?
Well, you know, I don't even know if I should say this, but he actually died. Like, he died of, like, a drug overdose.
Oh,
so,
jeez. I was kidding.
I know, I don't mean to bring it up, but, like, you know, like, the guy, like, he's most modeled after is no longer with us, so. But other people will be there, and, sorry, I shouldn't have said it. I went too dark, but
You should have been like, he's
it's true.
great.
So I think we all are destined to find some part of our adolescence, be nostalgic for some part of our adolescence. But do you, in your mind, was there something special about the 80s that makes it particularly rich for this kind of mining of material?
That's a great question. I wonder about this too, because you hear so much about how, you know, oh, we're having an 80s moment because of Stranger Things and the Americans, and, you know, and people keep saying to me, why are the 80s so popular right now? You know, U2 is touring stadiums again. But I actually don't think it's anything new. I realized that, remember the movie The Wedding Singer with Adam Sandler, where he, like, you know, and he's like, he feathers his hair and he puts on the blue tuxedo? That came out in 1997. So basically 7 years after the 80s were over, we already missed the 80s. and you know, to put that in context, that would be like a movie now about like 2005. You know, like, who's nostalgic for 2005? Nope. And, you know, you know, I mean, I feel like the last 20 years we've seen like a zillion remakes of like every 80 movie, you know, like Fame and Clash of the Titans and Nightmare on Elm Street and all that stuff. And my best guess at it is that, like, you know, some people have this theory that it's because, well, all the people who make decisions are now, like, in their 40s and 50s, so, like, they're nostalgic for their childhood, so they're greenlighting all this stuff. But the Wedding Singer thing sort of disproves that, because that was 20 years ago. But I do think there's something about the 80s, like, the 80s was, like, the last time, like, we could sort of agree on what good was, you know what I mean? Like, back then, like, we agreed that Thriller was amazing, and we bought so many copies. It was, like, the best-selling album of all time, you know? And we agreed E.T. was amazing. And no movie has been #1 at the box office longer than, like, E.T. and MASH. More people watch MASH. And then, like, after the 80s, like, everything splintered, you know? Like, we got the 90s, we got the internet. Now you watch Duck Dynasty and I watch Modern Family, and someone else is watching Home and Garden Channel or whatever. And, like, I don't know what people are going to write about in the future. I don't know, like, what nostalgia for now will look like, because I think we're all listening and watching and reading different things. And I think the 80s was the last time, you know, we all sort of got together and shared these things together because it was all we had, you know? I don't know. That's like the start of a theory, but I don't fully know what it means yet.
That's a great point. I think it's right.
All right, good. You need to just follow me around. Like, anytime I say something, just back me up. You also need to come home with me to my house.
I was thinking just about Stranger Things and wondering how much the idea of freedom, children having freedom away from their parents. I mean, you set it up, I haven't read the book, but you set it up that the mom is working, and I was wondering how much that plays into what the kids could get into and up to, and how important maybe if that's some theme that you're wondering about.
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's definitely different now. You know what I mean? Like, I love that, like, the kids are unsupervised. It allows, you know, to have, like, a really interesting story because they can do anything, you know. And it's funny. My mother was home every night. She did not leave me alone. But I had a friend whose mother did work nights at the Food Town. It wasn't Food World. It was Food Town. And she would leave all 3 of her kids unsupervised while she worked the night shift because it paid more money. And she put the 12-year-old in charge. So his house was, like, party central for 12-year-olds, you know what I mean? So we were, blending milkshakes and eating Twinkies, and not really getting into trouble. But I don't know that would happen now, I mean, it's different time, so.
I'm curious about Quirk Books. Like, what is the Quirk and Quirk, and what's kind of the gist of the company, the type of things they want to publish?
Yeah, so, well, I mean, it's complicated because, like, the marketplace has been changing, like, constantly. Like, books are changing. Certain kinds of books are more popular now than and other kinds of books are sort of going away, like travel guides. It used to be a big thing, and you don't see too much of those anymore. And so our list has been changing constantly over the last 17 years. But I mean, the common denominator among all the books is, we always try to look for things that we feel are sort of unique. People who are working, outside the box, doing things. We use this phrase "strikingly unconventional" a lot because I think we looked up quirky in the dictionary and that's what it said. So, like in the broadest possible terms, like that's what we're looking for. I heard a story. I love this. I love to tell this story because I think it makes Quirk look good. But after people know 50 Shades of Grey, you heard about this book, 50 Shades of Grey? So after 50 Shades of Grey blew up, like there was this 1 week in publishing where suddenly the sales went nuts. And I have a friend who works at a really big literary agency, and he told me how they had a staff meeting. They called everybody into the room, and they said, okay, we need the next 50 Shades of Grey. What is it? We're not leaving this room till we figure it out. And they're just, like, the meeting was, how can we knock off 50 Shades of Grey, and we need to do it fast. And there's some Quirk people here tonight. They know we've never had a meeting like that. Like, we'd be embarrassed to have that meeting, because, like, why would you do that? You know what I mean? Like, come up with your own idea. And so, we spent a lot of time networking and just trying to meet interesting people, interesting writers, interesting illustrators, interesting photographers. That's sort of what we do, and it's the best part about the job because you get to interact with really, really cool people.
Jason, what would be the most satisfying success for this book on every level?
Double-spaced essay.
I don't know. I feel like this is it. Like right here is like I'm like happy. Like I'm happy with the book. I'm happy with the way it came out. I'm good. I like what it is. I don't know. I mean, I hope people read it and enjoy it. I love to think that they will. But do you want a number? Like, yeah. I think that's going to be good.
Cool. Well, thank you everybody for coming out.
Thank you very much.
Jason Rekulak.